And we're live today, rethinking data monetization. Welcome, welcome. Vibhav, Tara, Francis, Ryan, Sundar, and soon to be Fabio from Data Reply. How is everybody?
Great, thank you.
All good.
Doing
Excellent.
well. Doing well.
And how many countries, how many continents are we covering today? So Vibhav, India, so that's one there. Tara, Liverpool, UK. Francis, Malta.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, sunny Milton Keynes, or are you out of town at the moment?
Oh no, I'm based in Manchester.
Manchester, of course, sunny Manchester. Sundar, Bangalore, I think you said, is that right?
Yeah.
Fabio, Milan.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, amazing. Good. Good. We're covering some landmass. That's what we like. The topic is rethinking data monetization. Not a million miles from last month's conversation, which was the business rationale for ethical AI. Vibhav, I've asked you to come back onto this panel. Can you set the scene for us a little bit, maybe connect the dots between last month and this month, and maybe from your perspective, why are we on this topic? Why is it so important?
Thanks, Richard. No, so I think this topic fits in very well. Last month, we discussed the business rationale for ethical AI. Rethinking data monetization fits very well into it for factors. And I'm going to bring in points that were said last time and sort of connect it to data monetization first. To build ethical AI, you need all stakeholders, that is companies, regulators, and consumers, a point that might fit in when we're talking about data monetization. It's about you have to raise awareness. Applied in the data monetization context, it could be how our data is being collected, how it's being stored, how it's being used, awareness amongst users about the same. Then also aspects such as once we are aware about users, whether users take responsibility. Responsibility in the data monetization context would be curiosity. Do I know where my data is going? What is happening to it? And then to come to the rationale, where the 2 points that came in very specifically in the last conversation was trust and integrity. Trust, building consumer confidence. You have to build trust, because without trust, you could say anything in text, you could act anything, but if the consumer or the user, the market doesn't believe you, it doesn't go that far. So that's one rational trust. Second was integrity, another point that came in, which is that do you walk the talk, simply put. You project one thing, does a business project one thing, and does it act on it? So this was a conversation last time, and we sort of blending in data monetization within this setting.
Fantastic. You've brought up many, many key topics there we're going to dive into. Sundar, this is your day job, isn't it? This is what you get up in the morning and think about and work on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing research in this area, and it's a pretty exciting area, I should say.
Excellent, excellent. And let's just whiz around the room and get everybody's voice onto this LinkedIn Live before we open up more and more debate and dialogue and answer questions that are coming through. Nick, great to see you. Some questions that we'll get to in a second. Lavina, same. Mohammed, great to see you here. Ryan, we're probably going to end up talking about personal data quite a bit here, aren't we? But that's not the whole story, is it? Data is far wider than just the complaints that we might have about Facebook or Google or other and what they're doing with our data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of the most powerful data sets out there relate to the environment right now, and there's so much of asset data. I think the focus around personal data is because of the privacy issues, because there are certain privacy issues associated with personal data. But I think my stance on this today is it's not only about personal data. There's a whole lot more that we can do with data monetization other than personal data sets.
Thank you very much. Tara, welcome as well. Let's say a quick hello to you. Studying around law and AI. Does your focus land on the personal data more than other areas, or is your remit broader as well, like Ryan's describing?
Thanks for introducing me, Richard. Yeah, my focus is majority around personal data. I'm focusing on the automation of the law and looking into a lot of ethical views and how we can keep all the data that is recorded about cases and all different legal aspects just private. But obviously there's a lot of complications with automating the law, so there's plenty to delve into.
And it's quite an emotive subject, this, isn't it? Because it does affect us, and we do blend all of these things, perhaps correctly, perhaps not so much. Hello, Creative Sparks. Great to see you. Because we get into this ethics, we get into privacy, we get into trust, and then we get into kind of individual needs versus societal needs versus what corporations are trying to do and governments are trying to do. And it certainly can become emotive, like I'm describing. So let's come down to ground zero before we get into any of that melee, those weeds of this conversation. Fabio, what is data monetization? I mean, what do companies do now successfully around data that's working well in industry?
Thank you, Richard. So from my point of view, definitely I'm working with him mostly on the business. So my point of view is how it can support usually end users and companies to make most of the data itself. So data monetization, I think the first time I'm not sure I heard about it, but definitely I discussed about it was 2014, 2015. That's probably the first time I remember I started to speak about the topic. So it's the topic itself definitely is not a recent one, but changed a lot of things. So first of all, privacy, and for sure there is a lot of attention on the privacy. For business, it's let's say a legal need to manage the data in the right way. So that's definitely let me call a challenge that wasn't in 2014, 2015. One even probably was thinking about privacy issues, or not in this way. The other one is ethics, which is another probably hot topic together with privacy and data privacy. So businesses, the idea of the business is changing a lot, because we know that now is changing. Probably there is more attention, but since probably 5 years or 10 years ago, I would say probably 5 years ago, the attention was on the profit. So the idea of data monetization was absolutely on the profit, was the only thing. Now I think that data monetization is more how to improve services, not only making profits. For example, from my angle, there is a lot of attention on IoT. IoT is probably the extreme of creating data and understanding how you can leverage this data. And the other thing I would like to say, and hopefully we have time to discuss today, is probably, let me say in this way, it's not just data monetization. It's probably around information monetization, which is not exactly the same thing. So there are a lot of effort, which is sometimes something that it makes sense to give value between having data and transform data into information. So that's probably even one aspect to take into account. Again, from my point of view, it's more on the business side, of course, but it's part of the society, and businesses are really keen now, probably more to evolve their offers even in this into this direction.
Thank you. A wonderful point to bring up about information monetization, wisdom monetization rather than just data. Francis, let's bring you into the conversation as well. Fabio was giving us somewhat of a timeline there from 10 years of using these kind of expressions. We used to have some interesting quotes, didn't we? Things like data is the new oil. Where have we come from there? People, I assume, have stopped saying that now, but how did we manage to get rid of ideas like that, and what's replaced it?
Well, you've invited a decentralist onto the panel. So effectively in our world, in the decentralized world, we don't have the concept of privacy in the same way because everything is local. So if you're sharing something, it's because you shared it, not because our systems or some other owner did that. Ownership is moving entirely, I hope, to the user, to the center of power, which should be the user, the home, the individual. Data monetization is the last thing on our list, but it would be more about using it efficiently, making sure it is the people who have access to it are the only people. If you have access to it, you are allowed to have access to it. It's basically the rule in decentralization. So do with it what you will. It is anonymized, obviously, and we just sit in a slightly different world for that. The idea that Fabio mentioned earlier of information is obviously central to us as well, as opposed to just data. We have a different setup, and I think that's something we could discuss, but I don't want to muddy up what we're talking about here with stuff from, a little bit further down the line.
Yes, I understand that, Francis, and you're here on purpose, and we definitely value this what's over the horizon view. I mean, Web 3.0, decentralization, we all know what's happening in finance right now, and for many good reasons. Don't forget, for all the hype around Bitcoin and whatever, 70% of Filipino people are unbanked. That is a massive problem to solve with decentralized technologies and currency. So very exciting. But we've got a full panel, so we're going to try and bring in many aspects. So let's start, as I said, right at the beginning. Actually, let's say hello to Jerome, who's here. Roger, great to see you. Jyoti as well. Wonderful to see you as well. So Sundar, help us on this. Does this start out as a trust conversation? Is that where we should begin today?
Absolutely. It is essentially a trust conversation. The trust between the data subject and the data processor in one or many ways. And it's about a trade where the data subject is sharing his data for use, process, and monetization of by the data processor on the other side. So if it's a trade, right, what is the compensation? Is there a compensation model that is there? Now the question is, should there be a compensation? Right? We can go into histories of how things have evolved. Look at I would like to take a view that at this point in time we are looking at exploiting data to the extent that is possible, right? And we are in the process. We may be at 20% in maturity in some areas. We may be at 80% in maturity in some areas, but that's a maturity curve. Anything in the history that has got exploited, there's been a norm that has settled in, which is you start with exploitation. Subsequently, you start, there is a regulation which restricts you from exploitation. Then you get into a phase where beyond the regulation, you start looking at paying a fee for exploiting. Then you start looking at supporting people who are deprived for exploiting that resource. And ultimately, you go into a stage where you go beyond just exploitation, but also reinforcing or recreating those energies for you to evolve the cycle or enable that cycle again. I believe that's a cycle that will happen. If you are continuing to exploit, at some point in time, you should start paying for the data. After some point in time, you will get to a stage where you start contributing to people who are deprived of technology or data society. You will get into a stage where which is inevitable, where you will get to start developing societies and then start creating alternative data points to sustain this whole cycle. That's the whole string that I believe in. Yes, it is essentially a trust conversation, and with the regulations like GDPR, CCPA coming in place, it's going to create more complexity in the way you deal with data. And this is going to get further implications as we see regulations like EUA regulations or high risk or autonomous systems. Those will have further impact. And similarly, aspects like bias audit mandated by NYC or children's code kind of references, all these will have an impact on data monetization by businesses, and it will be essential for them to look at alternative approaches. One of the things that I'm interested in discussing is about what are the alternative approaches here. And I would reserve it for the time being. I'd be happy to comment upon it as we go along.
Excellent. Everyone's setting up some fantastic conversations here that we're going to dive into. Vibhab, are we 10 years too late, though, to have the kind of conversations that Sundar's suggesting? I mean, it's done, isn't it? The die is cast, is it not, in this data collection already?
Well, I've always, the point is that it's impossible to anticipate all sort of regulation when businesses start moving. Businesses move forward, regulation will probably figure out a way, because you're trying to set a broader framework within which to regulate the different points of the impact of business. So I don't think it's late to answer the question. I think it's on a good view. The GDPR discussion started earlier, came into effect in 2018. We're talking about data monetization, like Fabio mentioned, about 2014-15. So we have the right amount of awareness. We have one framework, at least formalized legal framework, and when GDPR in a more broader sense, and a few statutes in the US in specific states. So I think we're in the right point. I think we're at a place where, if we're looking at it globally, we have a right mix of awareness and sort of regulation to move forward.
Okay. We've mentioned GDPR a couple of times, so let's just pick up on that. The General Data Protection ruling in the EU launched, I believe, in 2018. So we're 3 years plus into that. Tara, we've seen California. There are other US states that are looking to put some legislation out, which is not too dissimilar. Are you surprised that we haven't seen more regions or countries creating their own versions of this in the 3 years since GDPR was launched?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are plenty of gaps that need filling, and it's just astronomical how countries are just letting all these technological advancements happen and not putting any legislation in place. I think this ties in very well with the principles of ethical AI as well. You know, like trust and fairness, and just keeping all of those things in mind, and how organizations and conglomerates are just able to go ahead and create these monstrosities in some instances, you know, not taking these principles into consideration, and then they're just completely bypassing any need for having legislation in place. So yeah, it's, to answer the question, yeah, I definitely think it's needed, and countries and areas should act a lot quicker.
Thank you. Fabio, when you're not based in Milan, you're based in Victoria in London. London has an incredible AI sector. So let's just keep balancing these views as we go through. I believe it's worth about 3.3, maybe 3.5 billion dollars, the UK, the London AI sector. I know Babylon Health being a big part of that, obviously worth something like 2 billion. So that does skew it slightly. But London is a bigger center for AI than the rest of Europe put together, which is a phenomenal number, phenomenal percentage when you think about it. It's seriously valuable. It's great for GDP. It's a big part of our growth in this country. 30,000 people, I think, on LinkedIn, you know, claim to be working in London and working in AI. So this is really important, isn't it? The development of this sector economically.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that first of all, especially from a technological point of view, the interest of using, or let me say in a better way, the maturity of using artificial intelligence now is starting to be definitely better than some years ago. But artificial intelligence has to leverage data in first instance. That's probably the most important thing. So when you speak about just about artificial intelligence as a trend or a hot topic, of course, it's interesting to see futuristic applications. But if you see right now, there are a lot of, let me use machine learning instead of artificial intelligence. Probably it's the right moment. especially from a more application point of view from the clients. Different industries are working with artificial intelligence. London is a central hub for sure. One reason I moved, my experience was especially in Italy, which is definitely a good place to use technology, but it's not always, it's not usual, unfortunately, the place where to start to use new technology, and artificial intelligence is the same. So the ecosystem, and again, just technological ecosystem around artificial intelligence in London is quite, let's say, it's quite interesting at the moment. Not just from, let's say, from an academic point of view, but a lot of industries, like, for example, banks, financial institutions are using artificial intelligence a lot. And linked to this topic, the topic of today, probably where you need to work with consumers, you have to take attention on how to use data to then feed. Let me use this word, to feed artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is really powerful, but we need to balance the use of data in the right way. When I said information is definitely something that could come from artificial intelligence, and that's probably a link between data and artificial intelligence, and it will be even more probably in the future, because we are trying to automatize most of results from data. So my point of view, so I have probably, let me say, two hats. One is technological, and technologies are moving quite fast. The other one is probably a business model. So how we can definitely leverage in, I want to use, especially in the good way, data, information, and technologies. That's another hot topic. We don't have probably time today to deep into it, but that's absolutely linked to this topic as well. I just want to say one thing on this, because most of the attention is usually the privacy of data, or how to use properly data from, let's say, companies. So are they allowed to use our data? Are they giving us enough information on how they are using our data? One question is on my side. It's not exactly my direct business, daily business, but are we allowed in some way to sell our data? Because that's another, I think, important angle. Because all right, let's say that a company give you the opportunity to use your data or not. But is it, and I use the word ethical, is it ethical from us to sell all our data, everything? Because that's another aspect. So I think it's important even to look into, because I can say, okay, let's say that at the end of this session we say, easy, we just need to pay people to have their data, but will be allowed, and is it also, again, ethical to sell from our side all the data we have, everything? Think about all the data we can produce by ourselves.
Maybe I'll try and turn this LinkedIn Live into a non-fungible token, Fabio, that we can sell afterwards. I saw that Charlie Bit My Finger has come off YouTube now because it's sold for $500,000, that video. If anybody isn't familiar with it, it's worth having a look at. Francis, you were shaking your head, and I want to come to you in just one moment. Actually, go on. You put your mic on. So Fabio asked a question there, why don't we just sell this? What's it worth? A few $1,000 a year or something? Is that the answer here?
It'll always be the answer. Human beings are human beings. No matter what GDPR you put in place, people will find a way around it. What regulations? It's failed completely. Let's be honest. We have to trust human beings to do what human beings do, and we put the actual security in either the nature of the architecture, meaning that because it's decentralized, as an example, it remains on your machine, and unless you press that share button, it's not going out there. So rather than leaving that as a curated or an experience that's managed by someone like Facebook or Instagram, that's just done. So if we look forward, let's go 10 years, just keep it simple. There's very little data on our networks in the future that will be private. It will be as a result of having, expressed itself through the natural way of sharing. The only person on networks in the future who'll sell data will be the user at the end of the day. Operators of networks in the future which don't have servers there are theoretically hub networks which shuttle along data, and people who operate that could have access to another level of data that is more about the relationships in the network itself, and they could sell that on, and they'd have every right to, because again, we don't have to worry about those problems. If somebody has shared data, then it's available for everyone, and if they haven't, you can't see it. So we have a much clearer scenario there. Also, AIs will theoretically, look, we would create marketplaces for data which everyone has access to, very free markets with strong security and reputation, understand information within that. But basically, you would just trade your data if you wanted to. You could sell your data. It would be anonymized, or it could be completely revealing who you are. That is your choice. You would then have AIs that could engage on those marketplaces at very high speed with each other. So if, say, scientists wanted a set of data, it could negotiate that with literally with people's own AIs. I'm talking, by the way, not centralized AI, obviously. That is the end of the world. I'm talking about decentralized AI, which is a tool for individuals. And those individual tools will be on those marketplaces. They will be negotiating with each other. And for instance, if you needed some scientific or medical data, they could possibly go in there and literally just ask users, hey, do you mind sharing some of your data? This is how much we'll give you. So we leave it to the user.
What a wonderful way to describe it. And I have many more questions that I hope we'll get to today on that. Francis, Ryan, let me bring your mic back on a bit here. We're describing a situation here. On one hand, we've got the extremes, the companies with football pitch-sized data centers who, frankly, can just keep the data coming in all day, and they're happy to try out all sorts of IoT data, which we'll touch on later. Perhaps ask Sundar for some thoughts on that. On the other hand, we've got the new world that Francis is describing, where more people get access to this across the world. We have more control, more freedom, more flexibility. It's not just data, isn't it? It's content as well. It's content creation as well that's in there. Ryan, when you're talking to your customers, you're at Amy. I mean, which way are they leaning more now as we get halfway through 2021? Are they still thinking we want to be more like Google and get more data, or are they thinking about how they might do things differently? What kind of conversations are you having?
I think we're having very sort of practical conversations around privacy and GDPR. So pre-GDPR, and I was one of those people who talked about data as being the new oil, guilty as charged. I remember I did a slide deck on from oil to rocket fuel. And it was about how you take your raw data and you enrich it and clean it and curate it. And the overall theme behind that was, Google sitting on X, zettabytes of data. They're worth, billions, and we've got 200 terabytes of data. Surely that's got to be worth something. And that was the conversation pre-GDPR. Now, post-GDPR, that conversation's changed from, there's value in this data, and we're not only looking at structured data, you're looking at unstructured data. You mentioned content, Richard. So we look at content as unstructured data. So any content that's being put out on YouTube, any content that's personally created by people, that's data. It's just in a different form. So I think the conversations that we're having with our customers is about how you place value on data. It's not about monetizing data or just directly deriving revenue from it. It's about how you place a value on data, and that can tend to be quite situational. And a lot of CDOs and a lot of the senior executive contacts that we have, they say yes, we do treat information and data as an asset. But how many of them actually list that on their balance sheet as an asset is probably zero. So I think the conversations that we're having with customers is about how much value do you place on data? How do you go about changing, or treating information as an asset, just as you would any of your other assets, like your furniture in your office? You probably, have an inventory that measures all of your how many PCs you've got in the office or how many laptops you've got in the office, but you don't have a singular catalog or an inventory that says how many data sets we have, and also how much is that, what is the value on that data. So it's not, I don't think it's about direct sort of monetization of that data. It's about placing value to that data itself.
I want to ask Vibhab about that, because it touches on Fabio's point, really, that there's obviously companies out there that get great value from extracting lots of data, but in the real world, for the rest of us, that's just a huge cost that may or may not lead to valuable insights in the company. You've got to think not necessarily about the value of your data on the balance sheet, but like Fabio's saying, the value of the information that you can derive from that, and the innovation, the strategy, the benefits to your customer and products and so on. Vibhab, is that how you see it, or a different perspective?
No, Ryan makes a good point. Value of data is an important point. There are 2 points I want to make. One, we've spoken about GDPR, and just to simplify this, GDPR is obligations on organizations to process data, and there are principles of processing data, and there are data subject rights. But GDPR is limited to certain sections of the globe. It doesn't apply to certain parts of the globe. So for example, GDPR, it can recognize personal data. Personal data could be something that identifies you, like a name or an email address. Then GDPR also has something called sensitive personal data. The reason I'm going into these definitions is when you're talking about data monetization, it's important for us to understand what is data, and we have a legal framework around it, so we're just sort of simplifying this. And then we have sensitive personal data, which is like revealing your racial, ethnic origin, political opinions, and information like that. Now, GDPR helps regulate that, but what happens to the rest of the globe? Now, with that rest of the globe is what I want to connect to the value of data. Value of data, let's simplify this further. I am, as a consumer, as a user, I am putting out data out there. Now, what value do I put to that data? The value that I put to that data is connected to how keen I am to protect it if it gets misused. Now, 3 points I want to make on the point of value of data. One, when I volunteer myself and I'm giving out that data, like an email address, that's fine, it has a minimum value. Second, when I'm generating data from my devices, like my browsing history, if I'm accessing a mobile phone, that's the second sort of setting. Third is when that information and what I'm browsing sort of leads to, let's call AI, in sort of predictive sort of manner, predictive data, predictive, like giving me insights from that information. So that information that gets created would be the highest value which we would like to protect. The only point I'm trying to make in this conversation, because value of data came in, is that we're looking at it from a company perspective, but we're looking from a user, a data subject perspective, and we're thinking of what I want to seek to protect. There might be levels of data where I might be, okay, this is fine, but this I need protection in. And when I'm talking about protection, there is a particular part of the globe where regulations exist. There are certain parts of the globe where they don't. Like, for example, India, we build, the GDPR came into effect on 26 May 2018. We created a report. We had the first bill in 2019, and it's still pending in Parliament. It's not passed through because of COVID. So it's sort of a movement in that direction, in these layers, from a sort of user perspective. So I'm just trying to bring back the conversation from not from a company standpoint, but also from a data subject perspective.
Oh, that's all of those points I completely agree with, Vibhab. I think for me, in the context of placing value of data, on data, I think my personal view, not my official AV view, my personal view is that personal data is off limits. It's simple as that, right? So when I sign up, let's put it in the context of the last 15 months. So I think in the last 15 months, we've had to kind of reevaluate ourselves as a species, not only and how we're going to take this forward. So in the grander scheme of things, whether my Amazon app is giving me the right recommendations, or whether Netflix is planning my evening for me properly, we have to sort of take a step back and think about, is that more important to me, or is the fact that there's a huge pandemic, and there's major climate change issues, and there's major environmental issues, and there's major, we can use the data that we are generating to measure the carbon footprint. That's much more important to me than Netflix recommendations. So I think my personal viewpoint is personal data should be a no-no. It's and I'll give you a practical example. So right now we're working with a government, public sector organization, which is distributing grant funding for businesses who are affected by COVID, right? And we've built, a data platform and a solution for them. But in order to test this platform and solution, we need almost real data. We need almost live data. And there was a lot of debate about, can we use this, because this is PII data? Should we be pushing this through our systems? And we came up with a simple kind of solution. We created some anonymization scripts, and also in terms of the postcodes, there was a very simple solution to dropping the last 2 digits of the postcode, which meant we still had location information, but we didn't need the who. So if you step back and take it to the old days of data warehousing, you'd have these facts and dimensions, and somehow the tone of today's data monetization has shifted from the how much to the who. And the reason for that is because we've made it so easy. We made it really easy to give away our data when we browse. We made it really easy to sort of hand over our data to Netflix or YouTube and say, here you go, personalize my experience. But truth is, how personalized do you need that experience to be? So so on personal data, that's my viewpoint.
Thank you. Very helpful.
I want to come to Sundar in a moment and ask a little bit more about this. Tara, a quick one from you. If you want data protection, and Vibhav said protecting a few times, that's about data minimization, isn't it? It's about companies just actually actively only collecting what they know they need to start with, I guess. Do we see trends towards that?
Yeah, of course. There are a lot of companies out there that don't actually ask to collect the data that they're collecting. And when just going off Ryan's perspective on personal data collection, whenever I was looking into like different things with data privacy and personal data collection, I was looking at whether it's actually necessary to rethink the whole monetization of personal data. And I was looking at that it all didn't just happen overnight. There was obviously like a lot of things that were put in place. It was drip fed to us as a society to just click the I agree on every site that you're going into. And most sites they're there and people just click it because it's easy. I'm one of those people, I've never actually sat and read every single thing that all of these organizations and company want to collect about me and about my experience on all these sites. So I actually sat and read through the whole privacy statement on a site just to give myself some knowledge on this. And I've always just clicked I consent or I agree, just because it was just simple.
But it's madness. Stay with me a bit longer here. Tara, if I'm driving down the road and every time I take a left turn, I have to click something in the car that says, do you want to drive on this road? But that's what it's like browsing the web.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one click to accept everything, sell your life away. And it's about 5 clicks and reviews and checks to restrict that. I mean, that can't be right, surely. Yeah,
I know, totally. And like, I definitely think it's just an issue of letting people know what they're getting themselves into, what they're clicking. People have not been properly informed. They've been told that the GDPR is there. They can go and read it if they want to read it. People can't be bothered. people are lazy, and just to know what information, what data is collected about you and what these companies are doing with that data, it needs to be reinforced more. People need we're tech enthusiasts, we're people who want to know about these things. There are people behind closed doors that they're just doing it because it's easy. That's just the way the human race is now. Everything's just too easy, so it needs to be.
If this was a business proposition, we wouldn't accept it, surely. I mean, imagine I started a business and you could buy my product online, my service online. It's $9.99 a month. And there's one website, one web page, massive red button, buy here. You can use Amazon, PayPal, Bitcoin, whatever you want. We accept it. And we got people on the phones ready to help you. And that's the buying experience. And if you want to cancel, then you have to phone this number, which you have to pay to phone. It's open for 2 hours on every other Friday. And you have to be on hold for 30 minutes. I mean, we couldn't have those kind of businesses. And that's kind of what we've got online, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Francis, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, isn't it?
I'd like to see how it could get any worse than this. I mean, but just this stuff about, you were just saying now, Tara, actually, about how, you actually bothered to read that. I find it a bit difficult when people say it's laziness. You said it was laziness. And I know what you mean, obviously, but it isn't. It isn't laziness. It's not you're not going to spend half your day reading the terms and conditions of websites, obviously, and everyone knows that. So, you put a bunch of these things down, you check something off a list. So you say I'm behaving well. And as a company, you've signed off on that, and that it's a completely meaningless situation. Let's be clear about this. There's no safeguards until you bring it back to the user and give the user 100% choice, as in not being asked what they would like to do, but they decide what to do. There will never be safety. So I think we all have to prepare for that. And when we're talking about monetization, I mean, really data is useful. So it will be monetized and people will want to sell it and people will want to buy it. And so we have to look at those two parties, the buyer and the seller, and that's going to be a company at some point and a user at the other. And that's where it will happen. It will happen naturally between those two parties. There isn't going to be any legislation that will ever cover it. It has to be done in a way that there is no way around it for the company. Either the person shared it or they didn't. End of story. That's kind of my feeling on it, to be honest with you, Richard.
You actually made this gesture here, Francis, of wringing your hands on it. But
living in Malta, I'm surrounded by Italians. Yes.
Some companies have done extremely well out of this. I mean, if we look at, I know you think I'm going to say Google, but take Alibaba for a second. I mean, they got fined $2.8 billion for malpractice in this area. And you know what? It kind of didn't matter to them. There's a sense that these companies are baking it in. We know we're going to nudge up against some boundaries. We're probably going to cross a few. So let's make sure that we've got some money in the kitty, because at some point we're going to land a fine and we need to factor that in. So they don't want to see the future that you're describing, because that's going to mean these massive investments in these data warehouses are no longer going to be as valuable or useful. But can they stop the trend towards edge? And I mean, 5G is going to make edge even more important, isn't it? What do they think about these kind of conversations?
Is that to me?
Yeah,
I'm the worst person to ask that, because I don't communicate with them anymore. So I would assume they have at some level understood where this is going. And the truth is, I think if you ask the vast majority of people, as Ryan said earlier, it was like my personal data should be my own. That's his personal opinion, of course. And I think if you're designing a system, you have to think to yourself, would I agree to this? And if your answer is no, then that's pretty much where the world's going to be. So it's kind of easy. It's super, super easy where the future is. It's practical. It's straightforward. It either works or it doesn't. And there's a lot less tangle in it and a lot more straight line, from buyer to seller or service to, that's it. So they can do it. Whether they do or not, that's up to them. Historically, when the internet came along, a lot of companies disappeared. I know you obviously remember back then as well. We were, telling people all over the place, hey, get on board. And they're like, oh, no, people are never going to use credit cards online. And who's going to shop online? These were the statements not 15, 20 years ago. Let's not forget that. So we'll hear the same stuff again. Everyone will be ignorers. They've been ignoring us on this subject for about 10 years, so they'll continue probably to ignore us for another 5. And then eventually they'll all be, jumping on it. Oh, we support the individual, blah, blah, blah. I would suggest it's good for companies to get a little ahead of that curve. If you're doing something of value and you have a service to offer, if you can monetize people's data, then offer them that deal, because they may take it and that's their choice.
Very, very interesting. We've had the topic of echo chambers come up in the chat. I think maybe Roger raised it. And I just find this so funny because I've been exploring some of the themes that Francis has talked about. You're talking about WebPIC 3.0, the decentralized tools. And of course, the more I explore it, the more I talk about it, the more Google knows this and starts showing me more articles on this. LinkedIn knows it. So LinkedIn's promoting this kind of content to me. And you end up thinking, wow, this is going mainstream. A few months ago, nobody was talking about this. And now everybody's talking about this. And of course, they're not. It's just Google and LinkedIn trying to convince me that everybody's talking about it. And it's fascinating to watch it in action and quite misleading. Sundar, let me ask that question again. And I might put it around to a few other people. Does it get worse before it gets better? Because my logic for asking that is that it's one thing managing a browser, and you can switch from Chromium and Chrome, to Brave or something if you want to. I've got a webcam in front of me that is just a dumb camera. It's not doing anything. But on IoT devices, watches, VR headsets, connected cars, let's not talk about brain-computer interfaces, but everything up until there, that these are a wholly different sphere of data collection. I mean, you sit in a connected car, you can't switch browsers. You got cameras on you and data being recorded. We're opening up a whole new world, and I'll ask about GDPR on this in a minute. There's a lot more data to be collected yet, isn't there, Sundar?
Absolutely. See, the conversations are moving from the stage of what we were looking at as trust conversation to a different new level of economic conversations. It's about data economics. So, like I said in the previous statement that I made, it's a trade. It's a trade where the underlying economics are not clearly defined. And I wouldn't take the view of saying that based on the nature of data, we wanted to actually look at monetizing it. Vibhav did allude to it, and Ryan also shared his perspective on it. But the challenge with something like that is, let's say, if I'm valuing my personal data to a certain degree and then giving a shade to it, that won't be the most valued data of mine in context. So basically, if a tweet is worth changing the scope of how a Bitcoin races upward or downward, then that data is more valuable than a personal data or identity of whoever it is, right? So what we are speaking about is not to say that tweet is valuable. What I'm trying to explain is that it is very, very contextual. Valuing data is very, very contextual. Fixing a rate, fixing a methodology is not going to work. And this also brings in another important perspective. We're speaking about devices which gather a lot of personal information, right? Personal data, which they converted to information, and they provide it back to you and many other users in terms of optimizing the process, right? Now, this use of data has a certain monetary value, and it is not a one-time monetary value. We're missing to understand that the monetary value service provider gains out of a data is not a one-time activity. It is at multiple points in times. The number of, let's call the number of times the monetization happens as n. We would never get to know what that n is, right? So we're speaking about two layers of problems. Problem number one is there is no compensation for data that has been taken or that's been provided by the data subject. Second, we're speaking about it is monetized multiple times, let's say by the service provider. The data subject has no clue about it, right? And with these two problems and the mention that I made with reference to it should be extremely contextual. Now let's look at the kind of IoT devices that you're speaking about. It will give you a lot of perspective of why data monetization from a data subject perspective is inevitable. It is not too far from now that antitrust regulations will become much more stronger when they start looking at the piece of how data is colonized, right? Colonizing of data is going to have much more impact, and it's going to be a newer arena for ending up paying fines for larger corporations. So with all this, I believe there is a need for relooking at economic model of data monetization. And this is not an economic model to say that my business model is to earn and monetize the data. It's about how I can make it equitable. Francis did mention that uh, when somebody is designing a system, it's important for them to actually look at whether they are designing a system which is which they would like to use, where their data would get exposed, right? So my point is, it's not always easy for you to understand or anticipate it or perceive it at that stage, because some of the people who are developing because they're either passionate or paid to do that in a particular context, and not at all times they're going to have a complete perspective of how that impact would happen. And that's the evolutionary process that is bound to happen every time something is created. If not, we would have solved many of the problems before it arose. So that is bound to happen. Only after the problem evolves and we understand the complexity of it, the conversation on monetization comes in, specifically from data subject perspective. And that's the critical juncture that we need to underline. So it is not about saying any value is a value, no value is a value. It is not about saying that one-time value is a value. It is not about saying whatever regulation fixes is the value is a value, because none of these are going to be true. It's going to be so very dynamic, right? The data that I end up sharing with a local browser will fetch X value. The data that I share with, let's say, a browser in the US or in the UK may fetch me Y value. So it is a choice of the data subject to consider where is it that he wants to spend whatever he has. He may be right, he may be wrong, but it's about his choice. Are we giving him his choice? And how is that choice going to evolve? And if the choice is going to evolve, what's the frameworks, what's the environment that's going to contribute to making it work, right? I also want to bring out this particular point Ryan made in terms of there are many other data sets which are relevant, which are important for enabling the humankind or for moving out of the current challenge of pandemic, as the case may be, right? But at the end of the day, I wanted us to consciously treat data as a commodity and data as a wealth measure. And I completely agree with Ryan that not just businesses, but also individuals should start considering data as an asset on their side. It requires a lot of change culturally for us to recognize it and then start looking at it from that perspective. That's the viewpoint that I have here.
Who would like to comment on that?
Can you imagine an app in the future where it shows you all your assets in terms of what Ryan has described, and you get to just chuck them on the market if you want?
Yeah, so that's an alternative proposition to Richard's business proposition is if my activity is being captured in a decentralized way where I own that completely, if there's value in it, I should have the choice of which bit you're gonna use from that. If I want to keep my movements on Google Maps private, then that's my choice. But what movies I watch at 7 p.m. every evening, I don't mind sharing that with a business. So as long as I'm given that choice, it seems reasonable. However, just going back to Sundar's point, it is because the fact that marketing companies, for marketing purposes, because they see that as value, they've taken that choice away from us. to a certain extent. They've made it so difficult for you to choose. Like Tara was saying, if you want to unsubscribe or you want to go through, now there's not only opt out, there's also that legitimate interest box that we have to go and click on. And totally get Viper's point, because I was trying to read a news website, an Indian news website, and it didn't even give me, it said, do you agree? And if I said I do not agree, just kick me out. It didn't even give me an option to go in and choose, which I don't want these 300 data providers to have access to me. And yeah, I mean, final point I just want to make, there was an ad from, I don't know if you've seen the Apple event, the recent sort of Apple event, and they have an ad for privacy. It's basically, a person keeps following you around, and then you go into another shop and a couple more people follow you around. Eventually he sits down in his living room, he's got like 40 people sat in there with him on the sofa watching telly. And that's exactly, that resonated with me so much, because it feels like that when I go online. I feel like there's 30, 40 different companies who are watching what I'm doing. And I'm okay for some of them to have access to my data, but the rest of them, I don't know. Sorry, Francis, you have a comment on that?
No, just to continue what you said, you were talking about the granular choice, and I think that is essential, obviously. And if we look into that, if we again just extrapolate for the future again, what you have on a phone, essentially, imagine a decentralized phone. It's totally your device. It doesn't communicate with any other service, blah, blah, blah. You're storing up a whole bunch of activity. You could just see it as your data activity, your trends, or the browsing history. It would be like in little, you can imagine like little entries in a list. And there would foreseeably be brokers who could even increase the value on the market for you. It would be very easy to anonymize that. So you can say, well, you can have my whole health history, but not my name. But if they wanted your name, maybe they're willing to pay you 500,000 for that. Who knows? It's, again, we don't make the choices for our networks or our users in the future. We're not doing that anymore. It's a case of giving the user as much information, as much choice, and as much safety in those choices, and the legitimacy of the information at all times. And granular is super important. So, break a little part off, sell it. But if we give them the tools to do that, that will happen. And if there's a marketplace for it, and obviously a decentralized marketplace, then we expect to see some really interesting activity. And again, it's the user's own choice. But that doesn't mean that the apps won't be able to say, hey, you're sharing something that could potentially lead to problems. So that will be all in there. So, you want to give them a little heads up if they're doing something a bit crazy. But you could just simply say, yeah, share all of my browsing history. I don't really care. Anonymize it and share it, and I'll make, €2 a month, but add that to the other 50,000 things I'm doing. And it's an interesting future.
Fabio, I want to ask you about granularity in just a moment. But Francis, just before we move on to that part of the conversation, what about the emotional value attached to data? If I've got a family heirloom and a porcelain duck, I think it's worth hundreds or thousands of pounds, and you say to me, no, mate, it's a duck. Is there not a bit of that going on?
There's a lot of that.
You're just a bunch of numbers. What does it matter? But to you, it's your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, look, that's the wonderful thing about all this. When we get it the right way round, or we flip it upside down, which is the correct way it should be, and we look at the user first. If the user has an emotional attachment, then they value that. It's their own perspective. It's their own value. We can't do anything about that in the real world. But if the marketplace supports that value, then there it is. But it probably won't in the case of sentimental value. So, we're just giving them all the choices, making sure there's a marketplace that everyone can, equal opportunity marketplace. Really just get in there, and you can compete with your data with everyone else who may be trying to sell their data, and the people buying the data are also in that competition, a lovely market competition. But again, with all things at the safety at the correct place, which is with the user, because it's their information. And then those emotional choices can be made by the people. Because then, by the way, there's another thought that if you're selling information on your mum, for instance, and your mum doesn't like that, that's something we can never do anything about technologically. So again, if anyone was to make that decision, it would be the family. So it still remains in the family's realm. It all seems to work out very well when you just flip it around and put it in the user's with the user.
if you upload your DNA to 23andMe, you upload all of your family's DNA. Like everybody's on there now because of you. Fabio, I said we talk about granularity. Actually, Ryan, have you? Is this your stop-off point? Is this your station?
Yeah, let me just add some bits.
Just 1 second, Fabio. 1 second. Have you got to go, Ryan?
I can stick around. I've got a 4:30, Richard. So I'm happy. The conversation is super interesting. So I'm going to stick around for half an hour if you don't mind.
No, that's fantastic, Fabio. My apologies.
No problem. Yeah, no problem at all. So starting from Sundar, what he was saying, I would stress the idea, first of all, of culture. So when you say data monetization, of course, we are probably the or some of the subject matter experts around data, of course, but there are a lot of places where people could sell something. But the culture is the most important thing, because think about investing your money. Are you able? Do you know how does it work? So awareness, it's probably the first thing, because if someone is asked, there are a couple of things. First of all, how much your data value. So I have no idea at all. Speaking about money, of course. So the other niche is probably using anything which is not just money. Maybe cryptocurrencies is another thing, but what a niche. I mean, try to say to your grandmother, let's say, I give you some cryptocurrencies because you sell your data. She probably has no idea what you are talking about. And I'm from Italy, where, of course, people with a very low level of digital culture is a problem. I would say is a problem. So raising awareness is the first thing, because otherwise you will continue to have someone just taking your data, maybe paying you something and nothing the value of the data. So the concept of a broker, for example, it's an important thing. Probably no great rock star exists without a great agent, because can you really sell yourself? I mean, sometimes yes, but no, it's not a general thing. So I want to stress the fact of the culture, not only on the corporate side, but it's important even for us, because again, we are talking data every day. So I think this is an important bit. Not sure if can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Yes.
All right. So sorry, because my camera just stopped.
Oh yes, you're frozen. Yes, but we still hear you absolutely fine.
Sorry. So yeah, I'm trying to restart the camera, and well, I'm of course the other bit is the granularity. Granularity is for sure a technological. It was a technological issues. But it's an important bit to manage from both sides, both the, I would say, consumers. So, and this is linked to what I was saying before. So, am I able to understand which data I can, let's say, sell? Let me use this word, sell, at the moment, and which is the level and the granularity of data I can sell, because we just said DNA. So what about if I give some data which is not just linked to me? This could be a very big issue. On the corporate side, of course, granularity is an important bit, because as much information, as many data you have, that the most you can get from those data. So that's absolutely an important level. And coming to the previous discussion, artificial intelligence, of course, needs granularity in data. I was mentioning IoT, and IoT probably is the next step we are now really considering. So what will happen when because now probably we are talking about data about our behaviors. So using, for example, navigating the browser, understanding even which data they are collecting, because you do a search and you have a ADV the next day. But what about when data will be collected automatically? So with IoT sensors, which is already the case, we will lose completely the control, and that is really granular data. So it's gold for corporates, but again, it's something that we need to regulate.
It's everything, isn't it? At the moment, if we think about the browser, it's what you type, it's what you click, it's, you know, where you go on a page and those kind of things. But this opens up the whole world. And I think this granularity point is one to carry on to. Vibhav, if I come to you and then Tara on this, granularity to me is not going to be the same as to Google. And I mentioned earlier about, you know, gaze on these kind of devices. You know, Google it if you want, and you'll see that you can see the eye tracking of somebody looking at an application on a phone or screen on a phone. So, you know, an app could very cleverly put something up in that particular corner, and whether I glanced at it or not would give them information about me, behavior, interests, preferences, whatever. You can't explain that in GDPR, can you? I mean, that level of granularity, you can't explain to a user what you're doing with that data when they look at a particular pixel or image on the screen and the inferences you can make from that. Because that's what's happening. That's not explainable, is it, Vibhav?
It's a good question. And I'm thinking to answer it directly, complete granularity covering each specific situation is possibly not possible in a legal framework. A law would take a general legal situation, would take a legal. What you're talking about, these are specific fact instances which may fit in within that framework of law. So the legal principle may not address it specifically, but there might be an overarching principle which would fit in, within which the example that we're using would fit in. So if the question is, would GDPR go down to that level of granularity to cover every such situation, the answer is no. But when we look at a particular fact situation and then we sort of backtrack and to see what were your legal obligations, this is what has happened, there seems to be a GDPR breach, have you complied with the principles, and we backtrack from it, then maybe we can find an answer. So, I mean, it's both yes and a no to that question. Does that make sense?
It does. Tara, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Vibhav said. GDPR, you could not explain the ins and outs of every single action that data subjects give their data for. The law is generic in that every action that we have, every action that we take has a reaction, and it falls underneath an umbrella for something within the law. So I think it'll just be following suit with that. Not that we break down every single action that the data is used for, but that it falls under the umbrella of the data collection or whatever the organizations are going to use the data for.
But these aren't extreme use cases. They aren't edge use cases. I mean, as far as I understand it, the Oculus Quest 2 is collecting millions of data points about a user, including where they look on the screen. It's got cameras on the outside as well that can take in the surroundings. This is a very, very clever bit of kit. $300, by the way. Not much, is it? Makes you wonder. Makes you wonder how they're monetizing that. And of course, there's apps and games in there, but as we know, it goes beyond that. But this is a headset now that's measuring your movement, your flexibility, your reaction time. It's not very difficult, is it, to track that over time and look at a reaction time 2 years ago, 1 year ago now, and maybe draw some implications about health and wellness or disease or these kind of things. It's a loaded question. All my questions are loaded, to be honest, but this is another one. Does that mean that GDPR is out of date? Is it? We can't just ignore these things, can we? We're going to have a new instance for this kind of behavioral data, the dataverse, whatever you want to call it. which is so powerful and valuable, right?
Let me try answering that. I mean, to talk about the broad principle, let me go more specific. Supposing, let's take example, there are principles of processing data, right? So you have to, it has lawful, there has to be consent, there has to be transparency. You have to be able to explain to the user what data you're collecting, how you're collecting it. It has to be fair. So I'm sort of giving you so there are principles in place. There's the purpose limitation principle. To what purpose it has to be specified why you're taking it. Data minimization, you have to take as much data as you need to achieve your objective. So the point really, the previous point really was that the answer would lie within the law, within these broad principles, but it may not be there specifically. That's the point. So the framework, in my limited understanding, would work. But if it is if it's a use case that is debatable within the framework, then it'll get resolved otherwise. I mean, there's compliance and there's litigation. So either in the compliance setup or it gets litigated in that sense. So there will be an answer that will eventually be found through the legal process. But so the point I'm trying to really make here is that the framework does address it, and if it doesn't, then there are other ways of finding a solution to that. So I think the framework would work.
Sundar,
just to pitch in.
Yeah, tell me about trust as well, though, when you do.
Absolutely. So I just want to add on to what Vibhav said. So valuing data monetization is a very important concept, but we also need to understand the moment economics of these data monetization is realized by commercial organizations which are using these personal data, whether it is personally sensitive information, behavioral information, as the case may be. What's going to happen is that they are stuck in a triangularity, so to say. There are going to be regulations which are going to be demanding them to pay fines for misuse of data. That could be GDPR, that could be some other regulation that evolves. And I don't think that's going to stop any which ways in that sense. Second, there's going to be an environment where there's going to be more activism, where they need to spend more money to justify that they're doing enough for maintaining the data private and maintaining all the privacy effects, right? Third, the compliance cost of dealing with the data and monetizing the data is going to be high because they're going to start paying for data. Now, with all this, they need to find out alternative methodology, right? Let's say, if, as an alternative methodology, synthetic data could be an option. Now, the moment synthetic data comes in, the words that Vibhav mentioned will become much more realistic, where they only pick up those data which is relevant, which is very important to make a difference. At this point in time, use of synthetic data is more costlier than use of personal data which is freely available. So this is the same bargain like the electric cars one. So you're just going in the same cycle. You will get there because you don't have a choice. So that's the way I see it.
But I could go out and lock my car. I can't lock my data. It's a concept.
Absolutely, and that's the change which regulations need to bring in, which is where see the speed at which our personal intuition works and the speed at which government regulation evolves are not the same. So that cannot be equated. So we're just fighting between those two aspects.
But they've got it already, Sundar. They know my DNA. They know what I buy and how. I'm not going to change my age, am I?
Yeah. So let's look at it realistically. There is a problem with that. So because they have the data, doesn't mean that the data is going to be useful for years together. Some data may be useful for many years. Some data may be useful for shorter term. Some data may not be useful at all for them also. They may not have classified it yet, right? Or they may not know when the data will become useful. Right. So this is the difference that Fabio mentioned initially between data and information. They also need to translate it from the data kind of format to the information kind of format. it is necessary for regulations to intervene and then say what's going to be the way that this will dealt with. The problem is, if we are looking at regulation, we're going to look at 180 plus regulations.
I mean,
because every country is going to come up with their own of regulation, which is going to create a complex web of how we understand them and how we interpret them. Yeah.
Sundar, I could talk to you all day. Let me bring some more mics on though as well, because I interviewed Nick Wise, and he's CEO of Ocean Mind, and they're using loads of Azure platform machine learning to look at illegal fishing on our oceans and many other things as well, but primarily that. And he says that if a country has good intentions and says, you know what, that bit of sea over there, it's kind of ours, but it's kind of, you know, it's under our jurisdiction, we're not going to farm it. We're going to let it regenerate and you know, give it back to nature for a decade. Well, typically they do, and then some other neighboring country goes, oh, look, that's a nice bit of sea there to go and farm. So they lose out twice. They lose that economically, and of course they don't get to reinvigorate the natural ecosystem in that bit of sea. So my point here, and I open this up actually to the floor as well, is that, you know, I could have a wonderful relationship with Facebook where it is secure and they go, right, you've bought it, we've forgotten it, that's fine. But there's 10,000 others who want to farm in that bit of sea, and I can't have 10,000 monthly subscriptions, can I? Of $9.99. Going, please, can everybody just stop using my data? What's it going to cost? Get the checkbook out. What am I missing here? Who can help me out? Ryan's unmuted.
So, yeah, I'll offer a perspective, Richard. And when I was listening to Sundar talking about you know, it's like an economy. And I've been reading a book called Infonomics, and it's by one of the Gartner guys, so wrought with ideas, not very practical, pragmatic ones. But one construct that the book does offer is, it says that, you know, if you're treating you know, data monetization as an economy, or you're treating, you know, information and placing value on it, then the same principles that you have for an economy need to be applied. So like how you would have economic policy, you would need to have, you know, datanomic policy or infonomic policy. So you need to include that. And I think GDPR is your first, you know, step in that direction. But truth is, you've got the legislation, but how you effect that legislation is really weak. So, you know, to me, one way of impacting GDPR is when GDPR was introduced, there should have been a data purge of personal data. Now that would have changed the context, and it would have been, all right, now I don't have any personal data. I want your personal data. Can I please use it? And that's a different conversation. Right now, it's like, you know, they already, like you said, they already know how old I am. They already know, and there's, you know, how many DSAR requests can I raise? Now, the organizations we work with, we're enabling them to service these information requests and these redaction requests and these deletion requests because, you know, they're you know, ethically switched on. They want to be able to service these requests, but there's thousands, millions of businesses out there which are just all harvesting the data, and there's no policy in place, and there's no, you know, there's no control in place. So GDPR, great step forward in terms of legislation, but impacting and affecting that legislation, I think that needs a bit of rethinking.
Francis, pick up on that would be great. But one thing that Ryan talked about earlier was, I think it was Apple you talked about, Ryan, and some of the success they'd had. I don't think anyone's perfect, but they've certainly made a good effort under Tim Cook. But Apple's not cheap, is it, Francis? I talked about the Oculus Quest being $300. It's equivalent from Apple when it comes out. It could be 10 times the price. It could be $3,000. It'll protect your privacy, but at a cost. And 78% of Africa is on Android phones because of cost. What's the implications for local data storage and local devices that can protect you? Do you have to be able to afford them, Francis?
No, God, no. Obviously, we have to wait for the humanity to move on off centralized systems, but they just don't work, and they never will. No amount of regulation, legislation, governments kings, queens, or anything else is going to stop humans being humans. There's always a way around everything, and that's most of our world seems to be spent about working out how to get around things. And so, shoving all that aside, there was, I think, the idea that there's two ideas from the book actually. One of which was about data in general, where if you imagine, okay, hang on a second, do me the question there, Richard. Sorry, start me, because I'll wander off on 3,000 miles away like this.
So are we ending up in a situation where we can all afford Facebook's hardware? Maybe it's even free in the future, but we have this sort of invisible harvesting of data. But those of us who don't want that can choose not to have that, but we've got to stump up the real cost of this platform and system up front.
Yeah, I mean,
is that the only two choices?
Yeah, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take, there's nothing free. First of all, we all know that now. And we really just have to get everyone over to this other way of thinking, this different paradigm, you know, a user-centric paradigm. And then all of these problems we're discussing will be solved. But I mean, we've already lost, what I was trying to say before was we've just already lost a handle on the data. As Ryan said earlier, you know, it's out there already. I mean, there is foreseeably, and this is something I just wrote about, foreseeably a time in the future when we have a web page with everyone's private messages that we've ever written on WhatsApp, Facebook, all of it, just out there, searchable by your name. That's the situation we're at now, and that's going to cause probably one of the biggest social calamities that we've ever experienced. Just everything out there. If nothing's protected, it really isn't. I mean, because you can't do protection like that. You can't, engineering doesn't work like that. I can't say, this is very important to me, and now I'm going to give it to you and look after it, an unknown person somewhere else, and just hope that that's going to be okay. That's the height of naivety. So we just will not be doing that anymore. It will be on it, as you said about the keys to your car, Richard, earlier. It's yours. That's it. There's no one you can trust with that. And society shouldn't be asked to do that. That choice is going to be eliminated. None of it will remain. Smaller enterprises, smaller things where you can have centralized systems in small ways, like a single company can be fully centralized, you know, probably a merit-based hierarchy, but that's okay. It's just not when the whole of society is done like this, when all of our data is flying around. Just forget it. I mean, as you said earlier, as I think Ryan said, the block or the purge would have been good. We're way past that now. So it's over. We've lost the current world of data. Expect everything to be visible one day, but looking to the future, we just change it around. We just put the user in charge, because that's what we're all really asking for at the end of the day. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. There's no law that can cover that. It's your choice, and your human choice is complicated and weird and totally all about you and your feelings and your emotions, and no software technology or AI will ever be able to do that on your behalf. It has to come down to you.
Fabio, Francis is talking about shades of grey there and control and levels. We've sort of described some of this data monetization.
Sorry, Richard, to interrupt. Just a quick response on this. My view is it's absolutely important what Francis is saying, and what we are saying in general. We are losing the control, but not just of the data, but even which kind of data they are collecting. We have no idea, because we spoke about websites are collecting our behaviors of what. It's not just a matter of who they are sharing with, what they are really. And you mentioned the Oculus having some features, but again, which are the data? So we have no idea at all which are the data they are collecting. So even speaking about granularity, what's the granularity? I have no idea at the moment. For example, even now, what they are collecting on this session. Someone are collecting something. I have no idea. And if yes, what? And then there are a lot of other collaterals where they are storing the data, for which purpose they are using the data. So that's an important thing. When you were speaking, I'm putting this in parallel with the money, because we spoke a lot about the asset and our asset, and I was thinking about when we say they already have our data, but also banks have our money, but at least we know how much money they have from us.
Well, sort of. We can't actually all draw it out, though, can we?
But let's say it's a little bit more control than the data. But for example, speaking about money, if you are an employee, sometimes you don't own your data because your employee give your money to the bank and then they disappear somewhere. So that's another angle to take into account. We need to understand how to use data, but especially on this, I think one thing again is and probably about trustness also, and moving forward in having some practical way to monetize data in the right way is sharing which data are companies are collecting and are using, because it's the first step for us to understand which data I can then basically again use on my side as a consumer.
Yes, and the car is a good analogy. Is that I can lock it and says nobody uses this car but me ever, full stop, or I can leave the keys in the car and say anybody you want, go ahead and drive it. And we're sort of describing a world like that with data, aren't we? That the floodgates are open or closed. But of course, Henry's brilliant comments in the chat are picking up on some of this. And of course, you might want to put some, if your own regulation around that, your own principles around that, yes, you can have it for this period, or yes, you can have it, but I don't want to be contributing towards the global CO2 footprint. So I want some guarantees that it's going to be stored, in certain ways, or, sustainably, or it's not going to be adding to this, that, and the other. And, maybe we'll move towards those kind of dials and controls, as well as yes, no to certain data. We see that coming, perhaps.
Can I actually? Oh, sorry, Fabian.
Yeah, no, go on, Francis.
It was to jump back to the previous subject for a moment. Sorry, Richard. We were talking about sensors and the amount of data, sensors, as in things picking up data in general. That's increasing rapidly, as of course IoT and all this stuff. But as that goes, this all just becomes 4,000 times harder. And I think we are coming to a point where there'll either be just a blanket kind of, you're not allowed to share it, or what we normally see in the corporate world is they'll find ways around it and it will all just be shared in one way or another anyway. But I think it's going to be unmanageable for the current system we have soon. That was my point. Sorry.
So
Richard, what's the question for me or in general?
It was more in general. So we've actually got 3 minutes left, 2.5 minutes left. I just want to get go on,
just
please.
One bit on this is definitely is the next step. So technologies didn't really think about it until now. We all moved to the cloud because it was easier, and now it's probably the time to think also on the sustainability and how we use this. We can avoid it. I think it's a matter of move on with new technologies, not really reducing data, of course, given the fact we need to use in the right way data, but we cannot really stop it. It's more working in the right direction with technologies. That's my bit.
Thank you very much.
New architectural paradigm. Rather than any more regulation or any more hoping people will change or any more asking companies to be good or any of that, change the architecture so it's not possible.
I have to agree. If you're waiting for regulation or consumers to change their habits, you might be waiting for a while. Vipad, we've got 90 seconds on the clock. Can you say a little bit about MKAI and then take us home in this conversation?
Thank you. So MKAI, Milton Keynes Artificial Intelligence, it is a community where we engage in conversation on AI, different issues, just like the theme on data monetization. The community is special because of the fact that we have people from all walks of life, different professions, and the key point there is an interest in artificial intelligence. You can be from a technical background, not a technical background. You could be working on AI, you may not be working on AI. The point is, you are thinking on AI and you join our community. We can also follow us on LinkedIn. We have a Telegram chat where we discuss AI issues. So it's basically for you to give shape to your AI journey. Coming back to this conversation was absolutely fantastic. I was actually thinking and I was writing down the big ideas. I have two of them, definitely. One is that data monetization is a larger subset, and privacy and user privacy is a smaller subset of that. Second is that when we're looking at data monetization and rethinking about it, one key thing is that you have to look at the data as an asset, and that there has to be an economic model to it. I mean, these are big ideas that I'm taking away when we're thinking of this conversation. And thank you to everyone for this absolutely engaging panel.
Thank you, Vibhab. An excellent summary. In 10 seconds, would anybody like the final word?
Great experience. I think we need probably another 2 hours to go on.
We're just getting warmed up. I know we've hit 1 hour 30. It's flown by. I can't believe it. I'm so grateful. I'll use the last few seconds here to say thank you. Vibhab, you started and you finished us today. Thank you so much for this. Tara, thank you very much for joining this conversation. Sundar, Fabio, Francis, Ryan, of course, the same to you. Thank you for those who've been on the journey with us today. I've seen Lavinia, Odelia, Henry's been there, Nick's come back again. That's brilliant. Marcus has been here, Roger's been here. Suresh has been here, who asked me where this was, and I managed to get him on halfway through. So love the chat. You'll find it on LinkedIn anyway. I'll tag people up on this. Just huge gratitude for this challenging subject, and I appreciate all the dialogue we've had today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you all.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.